Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mario Loyola.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm Mario Loyola, fellow in the Center for Energy, Climate, and the Environment here at Heritage Foundation, and it's my honor and pleasure to kick off this book event for Nuclear Revolution, the important new book by my Heritage colleague, Jack Spencer. I'm not ashamed to admit that I've always had a soft spot in my heart for Senator Bernie Sanders. And the reason is that he's really one of our few living connections to the Summer of Love in 1968, to Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, to the hippies. And why do I mention him? Because if there's one thing that those old hippies hate more than Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War, it's nuclear power. Split trees, not atoms, said the graffiti on the wall at University of Wisconsin. These are different times. Nuclear power has proven the safest and perhaps most reliable energy source across the world. And if you think that climate change is a serious danger and you are also an adult, which is, I'm not sure how big that group of people is, but it's a growing group of people, it is increasingly obvious that decarbonization is simply not realistic without a massive expansion in nuclear power. And nuclear power is going to be important in the years ahead for another reason as well, which is that we are facing perhaps the greatest electricity scarcity crisis potentially in our nation's history. We've had government regulation that has been distorting investments in the capacity that we need, from renewable portfolio standards to the Inflation Reduction Act subsidies. This accumulation of policies is constraining the ability of the electricity grid to grow at the same time as projections are soaring for demand, from data centers driven by AI to electrification of everything, including the transport sector and vehicles. And we are going to need nuclear to be part of the solution for that. Nuclear power is a microcosm of the challenges that we face in solving these problems that I've mentioned and in achieving another century of American power and prosperity. There is, on the one hand, the promise of innovation, the incredibly creative private sector of the United States. And there is, on the other hand, the stifling hand of overregulation, which has imposed needless losses and needless obstacles to that innovation. America's future depends on achieving a regulatory climate that fosters innovation and competition, and that's what makes Jack Spencer's book both timely and incredibly important. To introduce Jack, I'd like to invite Deedon Baxendale, president of Optimum Publishing, to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning. Nuclear is having a moment. Good morning, once again. I'd like to thank you, welcome you to the book launch here in Washington, D.C., the home of the best government money can buy. But I think that's about to change over the next 4 years. And mark my words, I think that the incoming administration has made it very clear that we want to remove a number of the key hurdles that are hamstringing business, hamstringing the nuclear industry and others, and unleash American exceptionalism once again. This is our third book launch in Washington in the past 2 years, and I hope to make this a regular publishing stop. We bring political matters, to influencers here in Washington. We have a process we strive that democracy remains free and vibrant, and fair. We work with the NED, Hudson, and now Heritage to be provocative and challenging, to bring narratives forward to law enforcement, academics, and human rights advocates here in Washington. First of all, I'd just like to thank our team back in Toronto, including Liam Taylor and our editor-in-chief, Janice Weaver, who worked tirelessly with Jack to bring the book home. Optimum has had a clear record on exposing the egregious record of the Chinese Communist Party, its human rights record, especially when it comes to peoples of Tibet, East Turkestan, the Uyghurs, and Hong Kong. We have over a 50-year history in launching books that matter in over 50 countries and in over a dozen languages. We're a boutique publisher, and like Canada, we like to punch well above our weight. Optum has had numerous Canadian and American political memoirs that we've published over the years, and we've been a bridge between academia and the mainstream to bring complex ideas and narratives to the market so that a wider audience can understand. And I think we've achieved that with Jack's new book as well. I was introduced to Jack earlier this year. You know, our first conversation is anything between a publisher and potential author. Always is, you know, who are you? What are you about? What are your values? You know, what drives you? And I think when, you know, Jack said, well, I have this manuscript, you know, I'd like to kind of bring it forward. You know, here's my approach. I said, wow, that's a refreshing approach. Somebody who looks at a market, understands the need for change, the need to remove clear obstacles, to move an industry that is vital to national, economic, global security in the future. Jack had a vision, and I shared that vision, and I hope that we've been able to bring that out in this book. The importance of partnership, Canada and United States. Canada has ample supply of uranium. As a matter of fact, we're the second largest supplier in the world. We're poised to become the #1 and to displace Kazakhstan, and we know who controls Kazakhstan. We should not find ourselves held hostage to a nation or nations that are antithetical to the pursuit of freedom, Western civilization, and democracy. And some of those enemies need to be clearly put in their place. So partnerships amongst like-minded states are really important. And here in Washington and Canada, I think we can afford that relationship. America's trade relationship with Canada, we are America's #1 trading partner, and vice versa. There are 54 nuclear commercial plants operating in 28 states presently. But this is down from 111 reactors that in the peak in 1990. But I think with the advent of small modular reactors who can generate up to 300 megawatts in power, this will usher in a new era to unleash the potential. And today, this is the esteemed panel that we have here with Jack will address some of these key issues, and it will be open for questions as well. And with that, I'd like to welcome Jack Spencer, the author of Nuclear Revolution.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Heritage, for giving me a year off to do this book. Not really a year off, but nonetheless. So I guess I'm an author now, which is cool, if not unbelievable. But here's what a lot of people don't know. I'm not just an author, I'm also a movie maker. Some people in this room might remember, about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, the Heritage Foundation made a movie about nuclear energy. It was called Powering America, and I would highly recommend it. I watched it the other day. It still holds up. If you want to know how nuclear power works, it's a great movie to watch. It doesn't have an agenda. It goes through the entire fuel cycle from mining to reprocessing and construction, all of these things. It's a good movie, Powering America. The reason I bring it up, when we were making that movie, sort of in the midst of what was then known as the nuclear renaissance, there were two stops we made along the way. One was Watts Bar, and for those of you that don't know, that reactor began construction in the 70s and was shut down and started again. And that was the first really new reactor brought online in a long time. We were able to film down into the reactor vessel, which is like, dudes like me don't get to do that very often, and we don't get to bring it to the world to see. We also got to go to Vogtle 3, which was just beginning construction, but construction had begun. And I remember thinking that, and being excited, and everyone being excited, that what we were filming was the beginning of the nuclear renaissance, what was supposed to be the rebirth of nuclear energy in the United States. It wasn't, because it fizzled. There was no nuclear renaissance. We weren't filming the beginning of it. We were filming it, the whole thing, maybe the end of it. And because, as a lot of us know, the nuclear renaissance never occurred. And there's a lot of people blame a lot of things, fracking, changing markets, whatever. The thing they don't blame, the thing I blame, is government intervention, subsidies. I don't blame it entirely on that, but it's something that I think we need to grapple with, and here's why I look at that as a problem. People began thinking about nuclear energy. Private sector interests began emerging about new nuclear power in the early 2000s because natural gas prices were high then. It was before the fracking boom. There were finally there were projections that electricity was going to grow, and people knew nuclear energy had a role to play or could have a role to play. And you had this investment happening without government getting involved on the positive side. I mean, it was involved on the negative side, but it was happening naturally, organically, it was happening. And politicians do like what politicians do. They decided we're here to help. So they passed the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which had in it subsidies for about 5 or 6 reactors. And that was supposed to kickstart the industry. And what actually happened is it distorted capital flows. You got all of this investment coming towards nuclear. And that all seemed great at the time. Look, the Energy Policy Act was working. We're getting all this investment. But then when the market shifted, all that was overinvestment, and it made the crash that much worse. My point is, had we taken that momentum, that thinking that we had at the time, that nuclear power had a real opportunity, and focused our attention on fixing the underlying problems that increase the cost of it, that make the subsidies necessary, we might have been in a far better place. Maybe we would have been at the beginning of a nuclear renaissance. And that's the work that I've been doing since then, and that's what I'm trying to address here, because we are sitting at the precipice of another opportunity for another nuclear renaissance, resurgence, or what I think we need, a revolution. And what I mean by that is, or why I call it a revolution, is we'll talk here about, you've talked about, we need a lot of nuclear energy. Mario pointed out all this electricity we need. We're not going to get it with 1 or 2 reactors. As great as Vogtle 3 and 4 are, as great as a new SMR would be, that doesn't fix the problem. We need literally hundreds of reactors. We're not going to do that under the current approach. We need to revolutionize how we think, how we regulate, how policy is around nuclear power, and if we're going to get that done. So my point is, rather than squabbling over how many demonstration reactors we're going to produce, let's take our attention now and fix the underlying problems that lead nuclear power plants to cost 5, 6, 7 times more today than they did in the 1960s, even adjusted for inflation. That's insane. How is it that we in the United States could do it cheaper and faster? It took us 4 or 5 years to build a reactor back then. But having the experience of building over 100 commercial reactors, it takes so much longer now. We need to rethink how we do it. And that's what this book is about. Now, here's the opportunity. It's, I guess, holiday time right now. Do you remember this is my favorite holiday show. Santa Claus is Coming to Town. It's one of the stop motion ones. There's a scene in that movie. It is my favorite scene. If people who know me understand why this is my favorite scene. It's my favorite, almost my favorite scene of any movie that's not Blazing Saddles, where young Kris Kringle is challenging the man by giving presents to the kids, and the Burgermeister comes out and he's all irritated and he says, young man, by the actions I see from you, you are a rebel and nonconformist. And here's the thing. The rebels and nonconformists are now in charge. And while this can create what looks like chaos, it does create what can create fear for people who exist in this establishment. It also creates opportunity, tremendous opportunity to change the things that seemed unchangeable just a couple of months ago. So we need to recognize that the way we've been doing it, it's not going to lead to where we want to go, if where we want to go is a robust, sustainable, innovative, competitive nuclear industry. We need to do things different. And the things that have been building in place and gaining momentum and become the calcified establishment that seemed immovable might just be movable. So what I'm talking about, why I wrote this book, not that I knew what was going to happen, but as I like to point out, it always works out because it always does. We need to quit worrying about the next demonstration, the next subsidy, the next tax credit, and fix the reasons why we have those things. And anyway, that's my pitch for why you should get this book, because I tell you the kind of things we need to do. Now, you get these for free today, and I'll sign it for you. But after today, not after today, after you take one, I want you to remember, not only is it the holiday season to watch Santa Claus is Coming to Town, but to give these to your friends and family that you can purchase on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble. And I would just add, being the non-denominational, a multi-religious family of both Jewish and Christian descent, I would recognize that these would make good both Hanukkah and Christmas gifts. It's such a good gift, I wouldn't mind having it as a young Jewish child, 8 copies, 8 nights in a row. Anyway, I'm just saying. Anyway, enough about that. You wouldn't just come here to hear me ramble on about this, because I could ramble on about it for hours. Instead, we're going to have a conversation where my book might come up. I probably will bring it up, but I don't expect these guys. We're going to talk about nuclear energy, some of the challenges that we have. We're going to have a conversation. I asked 2 people that I've known for a long time who have been, who always answer whatever questions I have about nuclear, and have for a long, long time. They're both top people in their professions, but more important to me, really good friends. And we don't always agree on everything, but we always agree that, that nuclear is important and that we should keep talking. So I'll invite my 2 guests up to the stage, Mr. Kirk Sorensen, who is the president and chief technologist at Flybe Energy. We'll learn more about Flybe. I'm sure Kirk can't answer a question without saying how awesome Flybe is. And so Kirk, remember, we're here to talk about everything. Yep. And David Brown, who is a senior vice president at Constellation Energy. He's a senior vice president for Federal Affairs and Public Policy. Did I get that close? Yeah. Very good. Well, there we go. Gentlemen, I'm going to moderate a discussion. Feel free to ask me questions, too, if you want to know anything. and we'll have at it. So, and we will finish up with some Q's and A's, so be thinking about your questions as well. Gentlemen, so nuclear is having a moment, and we see in the news every day new announcements being made, ground being broken. David, your company has made news. I want to ask you more about that. Lots going on, lots of money going towards nuclear. It almost seems as if all the problems have been solved, and that all we have to do now is sit back and watch the nuclear revolution unfold before us. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on it? We'll start with you, David, and Kirk, we'll get your thoughts on it.
Sure. Well, Jack, first of all, congratulations, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today to help you launch this effort. It is quite a massive undertaking, and was really impressed with the thought that went into it, the research that went into it, and your always thought-provoking recommendations. So
thank you.
Congratulations to you and to Heritage. I think we're making great progress. We are on a nice run. There's still a lot to do, obviously. I think the things that come to mind first are, continued regulatory vigilance. I think that our friends on Capitol Hill did a great job this year of getting the ADVANCE Act through with important regulatory reforms that was done on a broad bipartisan basis. I think the NRC is receptive to the recommendations in there and the directives in there. And so we'll see how that plays out. I think that nuclear fuel supply is part of the supply chain that really needs some serious focus. We really need to reshore conversion and enrichment here in the U.S. And then I think finally the real key to kind of taking that next step and deploying in a big way is going to be trying to figure out how to manage the regulatory risk of completing reactors and how to allocate that risk among the various players in the industry and see what we can do to give investors confidence to pull the trigger on new nuclear.
Very good. Kurt, what do you think?
I also want to thank you for having me and also congratulate you. But I largely echo what David said. Those were all excellent points. To those, I would probably add a few more. I think that issues around the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, I know this is something you and I have talked a lot about, remain kind of persistently unaddressed. And I probably spend more time than most nuclear people talking to anti-nuclear people. And I want to find out, why do they have these negative feelings about nuclear energy? I feel very, very positive about it. I'm extremely thankful for nuclear energy. Where I live in Huntsville, Alabama is powered by Browns Ferry Nuclear Power Plant, one of the largest and oldest power plants in the U.S. But when I talk to people who are feeling against it, there's persistent concern about the generation of long-term spent nuclear fuel without a clear disposition pathway. And I consider this to be an entirely legitimate question and concern that they're raising. So I don't disagree with that. Where I disagree with them is the idea that this means that we should stop using nuclear power. I point out that if we stopped today, we would still have all of this spent nuclear fuel, and you would not have an answer to address it. But I do think that is something that needs to be tackled much more seriously. And I also think that I don't see a lot of efforts going on in that direction. Most of the efforts that you alluded to, a lot of businesses, a lot of things going on right now, they are going on, but nearly none of them are talking about addressing some of these longer term concerns. So I want to believe, and I obviously do believe in the new nuclear revolution. I believe in where we're going, but I think we have some retrenchment to do. I don't know if that's the right word, but the idea that we've got to go and address some of these, shore up the building so that we will be able to move and go forward. And dealing with our fuel cycle, onshoring of enrichment and conversion as was pointed out, as well as dealing with plans for the back end, which I'm sure is no secret to you that one of the few points we disagree on is Yucca. But.
Well, to be clear, I do support Yucca, but I don't support Yucca. I don't support the program within the context that it currently exists.
Yeah, I didn't want to derail onto Yucca.
I love talking about Yucca, but we won't bore everyone with it because Yucca's dead. I know, whatever. But I want to follow up on this nuclear waste question because I think that's a big problem with the conversation that's going on right now. It's part of what's baked into the original question, which is everything fine? And I just spent a few days at a conference on nuclear energy. Great conference. But the issue of waste as a policy matter didn't come up at all. And I think that is something that is missing from the conversation right now. And I think it's important not just for the reasons, Kirk, that you pointed out, but as I've argued for years and argue in this book that's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, is that it's essential to the future of nuclear energy, not just to be allowed to build more nuclear power plants, but connecting the front end to the back end from a technological and economic standpoint creates the incentives to move the technology forward. That's been my argument. And so I'm going to throw it to you, David, as someone who has to deal with day-to-day nuclear waste and the real economics of it. How do you think about it? And I'm not going to put you into a corner and say, do you agree with me or disagree with me? But I'm curious how you think about how do we break through this, this sort of stasis we've been in from a broader nuclear energy standpoint, not just from a utility standpoint, which I recognize has its own, interests or whatever.
Yeah. Well, as we've discussed at length, I mean, I think the biggest challenge for addressing this issue is that there's no incentive for anybody to do absolutely anything on this. The federal government, even though they've got a statutory responsibility and they are reimbursing utilities for failing to meet that obligation, the damages are being paid out of the judgment fund. Nobody is accountable. Nobody sees the pain around that. From a state commission perspective, utilities are no longer paying the nuclear waste fee because the program is in such a state of disarray that federal courts have suspended collection of the fee. So they like that. That's a benefit for customers. For those of us who have reactors, that material's being safely managed on site at relatively little or no cost because the federal government's largely reimbursing us for that failure to execute. Recall that they were supposed to begin moving fuel on January 31st, 1998. And nothing's happened. And we're no closer today, we may even be further away than we were in 1998 when that happened. So there's just not a lot of angst or consequence to not dealing with this. I think that the communities that we serve, there's not a political problem because it is being safely managed. The one exception to that is that the sites that are shut down, there are about a dozen, maybe a few more sites around the country where the only thing left on the site is the spent fuel. And we really need to address that issue front and center. I think that that would be the priority, but we definitely need a conversation change if we're going to make progress here.
I think one more question on waste. I think one of the problems with the current system where, David, as you point out, there's no incentive for anyone to do anything is that there's potentially a lot of value in waste. There's not only value in providing the services of waste management, but also whether it's potential fuel for future reactors, rare earths and other medical and industrially valuable isotopes. All of these things are in the waste. If we could have a system that would allow the economic value of both the management and disposition, but also the extraction of valuable resources, who knows what the market would yield? Like there would be this combination of things that would occur that would truly fix the problem. Now, Kirk, I know you've thought a lot about that side of it, so I was wondering if you could back me up on that or say, no, Spencer, you're just wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Jack. Just as you're plugging the book here, I feel like you're plugging my point because that's precisely what we're trying to work on is fundamentally to go and talk to utilities about how we can take this waste and a little bit of metallurgy and science here, but it's in a ceramic form. It's an oxide. It's not very different than your coffee cup, and to get it into a salt form, a fluoride form. And before that sounds weird, we actually do this on the front end all the time. We take all uranium dioxide fuel we mine and we turn it into uranium fluoride in order to enrich it. We actually have to turn it back into oxide in order to fuel reactors with.
So would all this fluoride that RFK is going to pull out of the water supply be useful for you?
I'm so excited about that. Yeah, I love fluorine and fluorides.
All right, good.
I want to turn spent nuclear fuel into fluorides. But here's the magic of fluorides, though, is they melt. They melt at much lower temperatures than oxides do. And once you've got them melted, you can actually use electrochemistry to go tease out these things you were talking about. So we can go and say, I would like to pull various isotopes out. That becomes feasible in a way that's extraordinarily difficult to do with the fuel the way it is now. But when we talk to, the federal government, they look at us like, we can't even have this conversation. And then we talk to utilities, they say, well, what does the federal government think? Because they're the ones on the hook for it. It's not our problem anymore, as you pointed out very accurately. But I think there is a hidden tax, I think there's a hidden tax that is being paid right now that we're not seeing, and it's cultural and it's almost social, where people have a sort of broad unease or distaste for the notion of new nuclear because of the lack of addressing the waste issue. that if we did, I think would remove that and help people see, as you pointed out, this is a very valuable resource that has the potential to do great good, in addition to being a future fuel source. In our strained situation right now with trying to onshore our nuclear fuel cycle, looking at spent fuel is a tremendous opportunity that I strongly believe should be taken.
So fluorides melt more quickly than oxides.
At lower temperatures.
At lower temperatures.
Much lower temperatures.
Don't say you didn't learn anything today. That'll help you in the future. I want to talk about this onshoring of fuel issue. I would argue it's the case. And the set of policies were perhaps legitimate, credible, and successful, that through a series of decisions that the federal government made after the Cold War is things like megatons to megawatts, the way the federal nuclear fuel infrastructure was, the effort to privatize it. There were things done in all of those things that led us to where we are now. Being a skeptic of government intervention into markets, how can we, as a matter of policy, do things to help reshore our uranium and our nuclear fuel industrial base without creating these distortions that lead us to a worse place in the future? What kind of things do we need to be careful of? What kind of things should we focus on? That's my question for both of you.
Sure. Well, I think we've got a good running start with the Nuclear Fuel Security Act that passed in the last year or so. It authorized the Department of Energy to work on efforts to reshore domestic conversion and enrichment capacity. It put a process in place both for low-enriched uranium and for high-assay LEU that's going to be used by some of the advanced reactor types. And I think they're making some progress there. They just made some awards on the HALEU side. They are working through the LEU side. You know, there are 4 enrichers in the world right now, China and Russia, obviously deeply state-owned enterprises. And then you've got Urenco and Orano in Europe, state-supported, not state-owned. So, you know, in the U.S., we used to be state-owned. It used to be part of the Department of Energy. Then, as you said, was privatized. That entity really became a broker under megatons to megawatts and is now trying to relaunch. So the utility sector will tell you that we need more competition and more competitors in that market. And the Nuclear Fuel Security Act kind of sets the stage for doing that and launching some domestic technologies, which at the end of the day are going to be needed by the Department of Energy that can't take advantage of some of these foreign technologies. So we're looking at an outright ban on Russian material starting in 2028. I think the domestic competitors who are looking to begin LEU production here have talked about 2030 as a target date. But that was a couple of years ago, and not a whole lot has moved on their front since then. So we've got this narrow window to get that jump-started, and hopefully the Department of Energy will continue its efforts to support those efforts and get plants built here in the U.S.
I want you to answer that question as well, Kirk, but I just want to follow up with the Russian ban issue. That's something I'm deeply concerned. I'm concerned that the ban won't stay in place. I know that it's in law, but we don't know what sort of machinations will happen. And without that staying in place, I think it'll be rough to get things going again, because it undermines the sort of long-term predictability that these folks will need to make those big investments. And I hope that it does stay in place. But I just saw within days they issued the maximum amount of waivers, and so there's going to be countervailing pressure to do something. I just hope that the government stays strong on that.
Yeah, so the waivers are available until 28,
right,
and then it's a firm cutoff.
Yeah.
I think there's going to end up being, kind of a three-legged stool. I think that Obviously, the enrichment companies are going to have to put some of their own capital into this. We as customers are going to have to enter into long-term contracts to give them that certainty to go ahead and build the capacity, and we're willing to do that. And then again, under the Nuclear Fuel Security Act, the government will have some role in helping get them off the ground and then let us support them through the long-term contracts.
Okay. What say you?
A bunch of things. Backing up more to the earlier point you made, I'm glad you talked about megatons to megawatts and the distortions it introduced into the market. I hesitate to second guess this too much. I will, forgive me if I'm just going to focus on the negatives for a moment, but megatons to megawatts did a lot of damage to the potential of new nuclear enrichment in the country for the simple reason that it brought in an enormous amount of equivalent separative work units, SWUs. These are the nerdy words we call how to separate uranium. And by essentially flooding the market with cheap, effective SWUs, it created enormous disincentive for American companies to produce new enrichment capability. We could have seen this coming when we did megatons to megawatts, that we were going to essentially really disincentivize ourselves to building new enrichment plants. And that's precisely what happened. So we've been kind of surfing on really cheap uranium enrichment that happened a long time ago in Russia. And then even after that, we were coasting along on cheap legacy enrichment from Russia that, they amortized plants, a long time ago, and they would sell us SWUs for very little money. And we loved it. It was wonderful. We were getting cheap uranium from Canada, and we were getting cheap SWUs from Russia. It was like a match made in heaven. And for about 2010 to about 2020, nuclear fuel was really cheap for companies like Constellation. You almost got it for free. That has changed a lot recently. Uranium ore has tripled in price in the last 5 years. SWUs are up quadruple what they used to be. We're telling Russia that we're not going to import your enriched uranium. A friend of mine predicted this not too long ago, and Russia's turning around now and saying, you're not going to import it after 2028? How about we stop now? We're not ready to stop taking Russian LEU. We're in real trouble if we can't get access to Russian LEU over the next couple of years. So waivers is, that's on the US side. We're saying, we'll give you a waiver. What happens when the Russians say, we don't give you a waiver? Right. So, and one more point I'd really like to make, and it does kind of connect back to spent fuel. We did megatons to megawatts around enriched uranium. We wanted to take bomb-grade enriched uranium, and we wanted to go and turn it into civilian fuel. That's wonderful. But that's only half the story. We had all of this weapons-grade plutonium, and both we and the Russians had it. And we did have a plan to try to use it as fuel. We had a MOX program, and it was fabulously expensive and finally canceled. But we need a story around plutonium, just like we need a story around enriched uranium. Right now, we have no sink for plutonium. We have a sink for enriched uranium. We can downblend it, and we can use it as nuclear fuel LEU. We have no equivalent sink for plutonium, and we need it. It is just accumulating, and we've got a lot of it in our spent nuclear fuel. If we want to go and tell other countries that we want you to have nuclear, then we need to be able to sink whatever plutonium they're going to make in their machines into our economy. We have nothing like that right now, and we have nothing on the drawing boards. I think it's an enormous hole in our planning, and one that we don't plug at great geopolitical risk.
I think that's a great point. I think that one of the things I talk about in the book is, despite the narrative around nuclear having shifted significantly in the pro-nuclear side, we're still burdened with this legacy of cultural imprint that has largely defined how we regulate nuclear energy. So while people might like nuclear, we still have 50 years of anti-nuclear sentiment that has found its way into the regulatory body that it still exists. Part of that past cultural imprint is our hesitancy to use plutonium as fuel, as Jimmy Carter was so instrumental in doing, is, I would argue, poisoning us against the so-called plutonium economy, when in fact what it does, just like what they did with reprocessing, is they make it culturally, they helped make it a cultural poison pill that now we have to overcome if we're truly going to make nuclear all that it can be. And so I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up.
Can I make another point about that just briefly? being able to use plutonium as a fuel is the equivalent of enormous amounts of SWUs. So, I mean, if we're sitting here at a SWU deficit for enrichment, and we were able to actually productively employ our legacy plutonium, that would help us plug that gap. But right now, we're treating that as if it's absolutely off the table. We can't use it. And as you pointed out, it's not changing anything. Every single day, our reactors are operating, and they're producing large amounts of plutonium. That could be a fuel. That could be used productively. If we don't use it productively, it's still there. So I will often ask anti-nuclear people, what's your plan around plutonium? Oh, I hate it. Okay, well, great, you hate it. Doesn't make it go away. It's still here. I'd like to use it to save lives and power cities. We can. Oh, it's for bombs. No, it's for whatever we decide to do with it. You know, you can use technology for good or for evil, and we can do a lot of good with these nuclear materials, enriched uranium, plutonium, other nuclear materials.
Do you have any other ones in mind that you're thinking about when you say other?
I'm thinking about thorium a lot, because thorium is a future fuel. It's a thing that can become a super fuel called uranium-233. So that's yet another option to go down, because through thorium we could actually consume plutonium while not making any new plutonium. One of the retorts that's often given around the so-called plutonium economy is, well, you're just going to make more plutonium. And I'm like, okay, that's legitimate pushback. There's a way to not do that.
Not that there's anything wrong with it.
Well, it's a concern. It's one of the things I usually hear from the government side rather than from the shall we say, anti-nuclear side.
Talk more about thorium, what the government has, and because the United States has a stock of thorium that could be usable for these reactors.
Yeah, every country is blessed with thorium. It's abundant. It's 3 times more common than uranium. We have a single location in Idaho that is arguably the richest thorium mine in the entire Western Hemisphere. We don't even need to touch it, because we already bring up thorium through rare earth mining. It is already a waste in processes that we're running right now. But thorium all by itself isn't going to make nuclear energy. You can have a big pile of it and nothing will happen. You've got to start that reactor with something else, whether it's enriched uranium, plutonium, or uranium-233. So it's a pre-fuel. But it's a marvelous pre-fuel, because once you can start it, it has the ability, without getting into too many technical details, uranium-233 puts out enough neutrons in fission to continue sustaining the reaction and to allow you essentially to consume thorium as the fuel. So that's a big opportunity for us. We have not, despite being the country that discovered all this and first demonstrated it, we have been actively discouraging research into thorium through the Department of Energy now for many years, much to my frustration. We buried 5,000 metric tons of thorium nitrate into shallow burial in Nevada about 15 years ago. You can go dig that out, and that's a great source of thorium right there. But most importantly, as we speak, the Department of Energy is trying to destroy the unique uranium-233 inventory of the United States. That should be stopped immediately, and that material should be set aside.
Which is created through thorium fission.
When thorium absorbs a neutron, it becomes uranium-233. So uranium-233 is a different material than natural uranium-235 and 238. You can't go dig it up. But once you have it, it is an incredibly effective superfuel for creating more and more and more energy. And again, I see a great opportunity here with addressing our plutonium and spent fuel issues while creating the superfuel simultaneously.
And what you just described is not a theoretical matter. We've actually built these before.
Yes.
And actually had what you just described occur.
Funny you mentioned Jimmy Carter. Little known fact about Jimmy Carter. We're talking about Bernie Sanders. I'll talk about Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter presided over the startup of the what was called the light water breeder reactor. It was the last core of the shipping port reactor in Pennsylvania. It operated on a thorium uranium-233 core in its last operational sequence. That was a pressurized water reactor. And what they saw after 5 years of operation was there was more fuel at the end than there was at the beginning because of this process we described. Uranium-233 had sustained the consumption of nuclear energy through thorium. I'm sure Constellation would love reactors that ran 5 years and had more fuel at the end than they did at the beginning. You know?
Absolutely.
So this was actually done, and while I don't believe that that exact technical approach is the most sustainable one to take in the future, it was shown to have worked, and it's funny that Carter happened to be the guy overseeing it when it took place.
Now, David, I need to ask you a question that I would be remiss not to ask having you here on stage. Your Constellation has made big nuclear news recently with 3 Mile Island. I've had a number of conversations with people who think they know about stuff, about your announcement, who claim that it's going to take forever, some that say it's not going to take any time. Can you tell us what that announcement was? I'm sure folks know, but just in case they don't. And sort of what kind of timelines you're looking for. And as a follow-up that I'd like you to answer, or something I'd like you to add to that. Whenever they shut that down, I remember them saying it's permanently shut down. There's no reopening this thing, yet you are. Can you describe that as well, or address
Jack,
that as
could
well?
I jump in for clarification for the audience? There were 2 units at 3 Mile Island.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't realize, you want to talk about Unit 1 and Unit 2?
Sure. Yeah.
Restarting the other one.
Yeah. So, right. Once upon a time.
That would be impressive if you could get that done.
Yeah. So 3 Mile Island was a 2-unit site. Unit 2 is the site that had the accident, and that is permanently shut and done. And
Actually.
yes, and currently being dismantled. Unit 1, however, was one of the best performing reactors in the world by any metric. At one point, it ran over 700 consecutive days between refueling outages, producing 24/7 carbon-free energy. And so at the time, that was a world record. It shut down in 2019 for economic reasons. It was just in a bad region that was surrounded by cheap natural gas and subsidized renewables and could not compete at the time. The story generally is when you shut down a reactor, you surrender your license to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They change its status from an operating reactor with an operating license to a possession-only license where it's awaiting decommissioning. Some of the plant systems were partially dismantled and kind of put in a shutdown condition. The reactor core was completely defueled. And so usually when you do that, you're kind of at a point of no return. But we didn't continue dismantling it at the time because we were waiting to kind of coordinate with the company that owned Unit 2, the permanently shut down reactor. About a year ago, maybe 15 months ago now, we started hearing from customers that, hey, there's going to be an enormous need for power for data centers. And our CEO at the time kind of challenged our nuclear team, well, okay, what would it take? I know we've said that we can't do it, but what would it take? What's the material condition of the plant? Let's take a look. And so that launched about a year-long process where every system in that plant was walked down and inspected. Independent contractors were brought in to check major components like the steam generators and other systems, both to identify their current state and to see what it would take to bring them back. And during that time, we had a number of conversations with Microsoft about entering into a long-term power purchase agreement to take the output of that plant. And the question was, well, okay, if we could get it restarted, how much would you want? And the answer was all of it. And so we announced just a couple months ago now that we have indeed entered into a 20-year power purchase agreement with Microsoft to restart the plant. It's going to be renamed the Crane Clean Energy Center after former Exelon CEO Chris Crane, who was instrumental in transforming the state of the nuclear industry from a situation where plants ran about 55% of the time to a situation today where our plants are running about 95% of the time. So just dramatic changes, and it's a real tribute to Chris and his legacy that the site of the worst accident in U.S. history from a nuclear perspective, which was at the end of the day relatively minor, is going to be the scene of part of the rebirth of the nuclear industry. So we have committed to restart that plant by 2028. It's an 835 megawatt unit. That power will be put onto the power grid, and Microsoft will take the output for data centers that they plan to use in the PJM region. The 2028 date is based on when PJM will be able to reconnect the plant to the grid based on the backup that they've currently got in the queue. We have told folks that we think we can have the plant ready to go back online in 2027. And so we are working with PJM to try to accelerate their process for evaluating the unit and putting it back online. If we get that done, we'll have it back online sometime in 2027. We're very confident that the components that need to be upgraded or refurbished are all things that we do on a regular basis at our other plants. And so we're very confident that that date is going to hold and that we'll be able to deliver for our customer.
I had forgotten about it, but I mentioned the Powering America movie that we made. The nuclear power plant that we featured in showing a operating plant was actually TMI-2. So another reason to watch Powering America once again. We've taken up too much time, and so I want to make sure we open it up for Q&A, and can I, so let's do that. We have a microphone. Here.
Oh, all right, but it has to be closer. There you go. I'm from the Cato Institute. My name is McCluskey, and I'm in favor of all this, as I'm sure we all are at Cato. How does France handle it? As I mean, all these problems, as I understand it, a very high percentage of the electricity in France comes from nuclear. Why aren't we talking about how the French do it, or is there some secret stupidity that they've indulged in?
Oh, happy to take that one if you want. What the French do is they run a fleet of light water reactors, not too dissimilar from our own, but they take the spent oxide fuel and they reprocess it through a technique called Purex, where they go and isolate the plutonium and uranium residual in the fuel, and then they send that plutonium back for fabrication into a mixed oxide form called MOX, where instead of using enriched uranium, they actually will use depleted uranium and plutonium as the fuel, and they'll put it back into the reactors for some further consumption. They do get more energy out of that, but they don't continue recycling it after that. It is a little bit of a, you get some more. It's like paying $1 and getting back 70 cents. They're still going to need a lot of uranium mining. They have mines in Niger. They may have actually abandoned those. I'm not entirely sure. So the French technique has some improvements over ours, but it also comes at a tremendous amount of state expense that isn't seen. I'm going to be a heretic here and actually say that, in my opinion, the United States actually made the right decision by not pursuing the Purex reprocessing strategy in South Carolina back in the late 1970s. I think we did the right thing for the wrong reasons. I think we need to get onto a much better approach to nuclear that would allow us to have sustainable nuclear energy generation rather than, although theirs is an improvement over ours, I think we could go to a vastly better improvement over that.
I'd just like to add something, because this question comes up all the time, and you'll get as many different answers as people you ask. And though I want the French to do what works for the French, I would never advocate the French model for the United States. It's a state-owned model. It's a relatively closed model. France is operating within a different energy context, where in the United States we literally exist in this era of energy abundance that France doesn't have. So there are a whole lot of reasons, I would argue, for the United States not to do the French model. the most important to me is it doesn't take advantage of what America's competitive advantage is or should be, which is free markets, innovation, private sector driven, moving things forward like that. That's how I think we bring what we do best. I think that in the United States, if we attempted the French model, it would just cost too much and people would be like, this costs too much, let's burn natural gas.
You'd be right.
Kramer, I'm the energy reporter at Notice. My question's for David. I'm curious, in that year-long period when you guys were investigating what you could do with the 3 Mile Island plant, I know you were talking about how it seemed sort of infeasible going into it. It was something that you were exploring, but you weren't sure that it was possible. I'm curious, like, what the big problem was that ended up not being a problem or being resolved over the course of that year that really made this something that is not only possible, but you guys are confident you can do quickly? Is it just the like extreme interest of the tech companies for data center growth? Is that what sort of like changed the game and the logic there? Or is there something else that happened? I'm wondering, like, what's the role of the technology neutral tax credits there? Like, is that something that's really important when we're talking about cost? Can you kind of dig into what the big problems were that ended up not being problems?
Yeah, well, I think when the decision was made to shut the plant down, we were putting that power onto the PJM grid. And so we were a price taker, and the prices just weren't sufficient to sustain operations. I think the 20-year PPA with Microsoft gave us that certainty that we would have enough revenue to cover the costs of not only recovering the plant, but continuing to operate it. So that was the primary driver there. And I think we were just fortunate in that we had not gone down the decommissioning road so far that it was unrecoverable. As you know, there are 2 other plants that are kind of looking at restarting. Palisades with Holtec in Michigan is well along that path, and Duane Arnold in Iowa is a NextEra unit that they're looking at possibly restarting. I think that, unfortunately, is probably the universe of plants that have been shut down that could be recovered. But for us, it was having that customer pull that allowed us to make that decision.
Jack, congratulations on the great book, and I just wanted to ask you a couple questions. If you could expand on some of the things you've already been talking about. This is mostly for you, but I'd like the others to respond. 2 questions. One is the issue of, you and I share a kind of a libertarian view of keeping the government out of energy policy, and one of the areas where government has played a big role in nuclear from the start has been in providing the insurance for these plants, and you talked a little bit about that. And the question is, can these plants be built without requiring, huge taxpayer liability? I think it was at the Price-Anderson Act.
Price-Anderson.
And the second question is, with respect to, our energy future, I've been saying, it's really the 2 ends, nuclear power and natural gas. And natural gas is at record low prices, and we have a superabundance of natural gas. So is nuclear going to be competitive, down over the next 10, 20 years, given the fracking revolution and the abundance of very low-priced and reliable natural gas?
Well, Steve, first of all, thank you. I need to point out, Steve provided the foreword for the book. So, Steve, thank you very much for doing that. And thank you for the questions, and thank you for asking the 2 most difficult questions that anyone could at such a forum. Now, being the free enterprise, free market-minded people that we are, I'm comfortable saying I don't know the answer to either of those questions, nor does anyone else. But here's what I do know. Let me clarify on Price-Anderson real quick, and David can probably do better than me, but I'll do it and then he can correct me. It's unfair to say that Price-Anderson's this big subsidy scheme for nuclear power. The nuclear energy industry pays into it. There's about, whether one agrees with it or not, the agreement that was made from a public policy standpoint was that the liability would be capped, but you would set aside an immense amount of money that would be readily available. You don't have to go to the courts or anything. It's there. And that's sort of the scheme that's been created, and every nuclear power plant pays into it, and that's that. That's not to say I'm a big defender of it. I'm just saying what it is. I would say further that Price-Anderson was put in place at a time where we didn't have 5 decades of history with nuclear operations, and I can see where, given the national security concerns at the time, wanting to bring the private sector in, providing that liability insurance was appropriate, and it just has evolved from there for what it is. So, that all being said, one of the reforms that I think is interesting that I talk about is let's see if we can get just a purely private sector insurance mechanism going, and if you're able to do that, you should be able to go off and build a reactor with a very light regulatory touch, because I know, as you know, that insurance is essentially regulation. It's a very sophisticated financial tool that assesses risk, and you pay a premium toward that. If small modular reactors, if advanced reactors are what we say they are, which is smaller, simpler, less fuel, all of these things, then they should be able to get insurance, or at least I'm interested in finding out if they can. And so that's part of what I talk about. That's part of this, the different way of things. I'm not for getting rid of Price-Anderson. I'm not for, right now, on this public stage, getting rid of Price-Anderson. I'm for setting up an alternative to see what can emerge, and then maybe we don't need Price-Anderson. Well, let's find out. I recognize, though, the risk that government, the industry is where it is. I'm looking to set up alternatives. On the natural gas thing, that's the reason I wrote this book, Steve. That's the reason, because the path we're on, I don't think, my assessment is, it can't be competitive, because there are too many things that are inherent in the system that artificially inflate costs. What I want to do is allow the market to do for nuclear energy what it has done for large screen TVs and cars and everything else. Not everything. What free markets do, which is drive up quality, drive down price, so that it serves the most interest for the most people at the price they're willing to pay. And there's no reason nuclear can't do that. There's nothing magical about it. We act like it's magical. It's steel, it's metal, it's fuel, and we have these guys who know how to build and operate nuclear power plants. So I think it can be competitive. I don't know if it can, but let's find out by creating some of these alternative pathways that will allow the markets to do for nuclear what it has done for humanity since the first person decided to put fire to coal, and Adam Smith told us how markets should work. Anyway, so that's my answer.
Yeah, let me just give you a little bit of a different way to look at Price-Anderson. It is effectively a no-fault insurance pool, where the first layer of protection is private insurance that we've got to obtain. The next layer comes from the company who owns and operates the plant. The next layer is kind of a pooled layer where every other reactor owner in the United States pays into that in the event of an accident that exceeds those numbers. And so, and as Jack said, yeah.
The companies pay premiums, right? I mean,
yes.
They pay for the insurance.
Right.
Has that lost money or made money for the government? I mean, I haven't really followed. How many times have we had to actually pay out money?
None. Zero.
Okay.
Never. I mean, there's really never been an incident where Price-Anderson's been triggered other than 3 Mile Island and maybe some defense activities, because it covers defense-related nuclear as well. So it's been a very, very successful program. The real key that folks don't realize is that because all the utilities share that liability, it makes us very vigilant at policing each other. So after 3 Mile Island, folks were like, whoa, if there's an accident, we're all going to be liable? Then I'm not just going to worry about my own operations. I'm going to worry about your operations too, because we're all held hostage to the worst performer out there, right? So after 3 Mile Island, the industry created something called the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. It's an entity based in Atlanta. It is kind of, think of it as a mirror to the NRC, where INPO sends inspectors to every reactor in the country every couple of years. These are teams of peers from every utility out there that owns a nuclear power plant, and they do a top-to-bottom examination of the entire plant. Systems, procedures, process, personnel, everything. It's a very rigorous process. And then they give you a rating on your plant. If your rating isn't one of the top couple of tiers, your CEO is called in to a meeting with all the other CEOs to answer for why your plant's not performing better and tell people what you're going to do to make it better. So Price Anderson actually has a very beneficial side benefit of creating this internal structure to ensure excellent performance in the U.S. And that's one of the reasons that we operate our reactors better than anybody else in the world.
Yes. We'll do this one, then we're already over time.
I wanted to ask a question about SMRs. It doesn't seem like at present, the present regulatory schemes, the present operational schemes and agreements and alliances really allow for SMRs as a new kind of scaling. Do you have any thoughts about what the future looks like for SMRs? I know there's a lot of exciting technology, but the issue is integration into the grid and scalability.
I'll take that one.
Yeah, all right.
Hi, I'm Sean Hagan with Global Energy Institute of Global Energy Education. And if I could just tail on to that question, is that what you just described with IMPO and the extent of the systems from top to bottom with the plant do not apply whatsoever with many of the SMRs and advanced reactors. And yet the industry, both the OEMs, well, I shouldn't say both, the OEMs, the utilities, and the regulators are all treating the SMRs and advanced reactors as if they do. And what that means is that all the costs are not good, the costs aren't going to be reduced. That what we need to do is treat them as what they are, which is essentially just a new nuclear system, a new heat system. I'll try not to go into too much technical detail, but essentially.
Well, I'll cut you off if you do.
Thank you. The safety-related border of these new systems essentially is almost at the flange of the reactor in some of them, and maybe one system away at the others. They're not tied to the turbines. Existing light water reactors follow the turbines. The turbines demand more heat, they send a signal to the reactor. You can design these SMRs so that they're not. They can actually fit in a building off. And they have to be engineered. I'm looking at Kirk and I get the same roll of the eyes I get from everybody.
Well, yes and no. I mean, what you're talking about is you're painting a very broad brush here. I mean, our company's an SMR developer, they're an advanced reactor developer. What's unfortunate to me is that SMR has come to mean a synonym for light water SMR. And of course, SMR is a lot bigger than that. It didn't used to be that way. SMRs actually used to be, they used to be associated with liquid metal reactors, but in general, low pressure reactors. And that's where a lot of these claims about how great SMRs were going to be came from. And I do think SMRs are great, but I see a new scale pressurized water reactor as a whole lot more similar to an AP1000 than I see it as something like to ours, which is a low pressure, inherently safe system. So you've got to be able to look at these risks and say, I look at it very much more simply than that. Are there stored energy terms in there? Some reactors have stored energy terms. Obviously, pressurized water reactors do, liquid metal reactors do. That's the driving force that can liberate activity out into the environment, which comes back to Price Anderson, which is our concern about insurance and touching back on some of those issues. I really believe that the older I get, the more convinced I am the world runs on insurance. If you doubt, go to the hospital and count how long it is till they want to look at your little magic card. You know, everything runs on insurance. You don't run a car without insurance. You don't go to the hospital on insurance, and you sure don't run a nuclear reactor. But much like megatons to megawatts, perhaps one of the downsides of the pool of Price Anderson has been that it has not caused developers and operators to go and say, God, could we be doing this better? Could we go and remove the trouble that we have in these designs that might actually trigger a Price Anderson event or a radioactivity excursion beyond the boundary? What if we had an approach that was unpressurized? What if we had no driving terms? What if we had chemical stability? Wouldn't we want that? There would be economic pressure to go and say, I want to build one of those, like your Council of CEOs saying, my goodness, this guy has a machine that doesn't have that problem. I want more of those in my fleet and less of these potential liabilities that I might experience. And one final point on this that I wanted to make, and I'm indebted to Jack Devaney for suggesting it, look at classification societies for ships. Shipping is a very dangerous activity, yet we have organizations around the world, the ABS, we have Lloyd's of London, we have Bureau Veritas, and they privately finance this. They do it by looking and assessing the risk and telling people what it's going to cost to insure your ship to go do something or another. They compete. If one is too expensive, people go and say, I don't want ABS, I want Bureau Veritas. And so they have an inherent mechanism to prevent them from going too crazy. On the other hand, if they don't do a good enough job, people go, my goodness, that guy said that ship was going to operate, and it sunk, and I lost everything. You know, so there's that natural frisson there within a free market to go and find somebody who will go and say, look, I want you to do the safest thing, but I also know that it's got to make money too. So I think there's a great opportunity to look at classification societies and global shipping and draw a parallel there with what we could be doing with nuclear energy.
And with that, I want to ask both of you if you have any final thoughts. You're not required to have final thoughts, but if you do, Kirk?
My final thought is you know, we're in this era where uranium has tripled in price, SWUs have quadrupled in price. We are, as the gentleman talked about, we're in an era of cheap natural gas, and we cannot afford to operate at a time when nuclear fuel is costing more than natural gas. We just won't. We not only won't build them, we won't run them. We've got to look really, really hard at lower cost options for nuclear energy and things that take advantage of our unique geopolitical advantages here in North America. And I would just strongly encourage us to do it and think really hard. Otherwise, we're going to find our nuclear option potentially evaporating.
I'd just say the future for nuclear is bright. I mean, I think if the next 4 years are going to be focused on American energy abundance, which I think is the right way to go, and given the demand for electricity that we're going to have, nuclear's got a vital role to play. So, you know, a couple of important things related to that. One is personnel. I think the administration's off to a good start on the energy front in terms of announcements there, but you got to fill in a lot of slots at the Department of Energy, especially the Office of Nuclear Energy. Hopefully, they'll have somebody who is focused on new plant deployment. And has the experience necessary over there. And then I think the other big key is going to be, like, get out of the way. I think that nuclear, including existing nuclear, has a phenomenal role to play in meeting the AI data revolution challenge. Reliable, clean power 24/7 a day, which is what these data centers need. But we need to make sure that the policies don't discourage us from doing that.
Well, my final thoughts are to thank both of you for joining me on the stage for the release of my book. Thank you both sincerely. I do appreciate it. I want to thank Dean and Optimum Publishing for working with me on this and making it possible. And most importantly, I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for supporting the whole effort. And actually, most importantly, all of you for coming here to join us. And we have books. I'll sign it if you want, or you can just take one if you don't want it signed. And we will close with that. Thanks, y'all.